Welcome everybody to the third sector strategy group, TSSG. TSSG has been running for a number of years now, and it's a regular forum where trustees, decision makers and executive teams of charities and not-for-profits get together on a regular basis to share ideas, share best practice, and build capability and build skill sets for learning. Getting together as TSSG used to mean getting together face to face. We used to meet initially quarterly between Daffins and Lodders, and so that was over lunch and over breakfast. But with the advent of COVID-19, we pivoted to an online model, and in those early days of the COVID crisis, we were getting together as a group online once a week. And TSSG has always been very much a community of people sharing ideas and sharing best practice. And in those early days of COVID, it was very much checking in to see if people were okay, sharing what was going on within their charities, the threats they were facing, but also just a question of reassurance that perhaps the things they were doing in their own charity were working. So we've evolved. We're still on an online model. We'd like to move back to face-to-face as a bit of a hybrid in the future, but we're still online. We've now moved to monthly catch-ups, and following feedback from individual members, what we've decided to do is we're evolving by every 6 months. We're having what we call a deep dive. So normally TSSG is half an hour on a monthly basis, and this just allows us with a group of experts to look at certain topics, certain hot topics in greater detail. So this is our first deep dive, and we hope you enjoy it. TSSG is meant to be very collaborative, and so with the presentations we've got today, we're allowing some time for questions and answers. So you'll find, you're probably all used to Zoom by now, but you'll find both a chat box and also a Q&A box. So as the speaker sessions are going on, by all means, please do put any questions you've got into that Q&A. And what we'll do is we want to ensure we have at least a minimum of 5 minutes at the end of each session to deal with those questions and queries. We also have an action planning break, which is 10 minutes midway through the webinar itself. And we're also going to be staying behind after the webinar finishes. So there will be an opportunity for people to ask their questions in greater detail if they need to. Now, the webinar is being recorded today, and we're going to be making a version of this available online. So if you've missed it, or you want some colleagues to be able to look at what we've been talking about, then that will be available online on our YouTube channel. Also, each of the speakers today will be sending a PDF copy of their slide deck, and so Sophie will be circulating those afterwards. So hopefully you don't need to make copious notes, but by all means, what we'd like you to do is for each of the sections that we cover today, just think about 1 or 2 action planning points that might come out, either things that you want to pursue with your team, or perhaps something that you may wish to have as a prompt for the other trustees within your organisation. So that's the scene setter. We've got 3 sessions today. We have a session on mergers and collaborative working, which is being hosted by Brian Jukes, who's corporate tax partner at Daffins, and Mark Lewis, who is the charities partner at Lodders. And we also have a session which I'm going to be running, which is looking at embracing change for charities, time to adapt. But our first speaker today, we're very, very glad to have him as our guest speaker. We have Daniel Fluskey, who is the head of research and external affairs at the Institute of Fundraising. So he's going to be talking about fundraising. So Dan, can you hear us? Are you there?
Great, thank you. And hello everybody, and great to be here today to talk to you around some ideas, thoughts about kind of how fundraising has been affected, how charities have been affected during COVID-19, what the trends are looking like in terms of how donations have been affected. Are people giving more? Are people giving less? What's that looking like? some thoughts ahead for the future as well. As of Tuesday, the Institute of Fundraising, that we are now the Chartered Institute of Fundraising, and we have a new logo and identity that reflects that. And this is kind of relevant, I think, to what we're talking about today, because becoming chartered and that having gone through all of the process through government, all the way through to the Queen sitting down and signing a bit of paper, bring the charter into action, tells us something about the role of fundraising in our society today, the importance of charitable fundraising to our country, to our communities. You know, this was all kind of happening before COVID-19, but you could probably say that, you know, even during COVID-19, the recognition of the importance of the charity sector, of the work that it does, is even more important and valued now. And actually having it officially recognised as a chartered profession shows the level of knowledge, skills, behaviour and professionalism that our fundraisers do across the sector in raising what normally is around kind of 10 and a bit billion pounds of donations and legacies every year from the UK. And I think that kind of element of understanding the importance of fundraising and understanding how it is done, and that there is a profession with skills and proper behaviours and values behind it, I think is even more important at the moment, when the need for charitable fundraising is even more pressured. Looking at the response of our communities and the public to charitable causes at a time of a kind of national emergency, I think also shines a bit of a light on how we think of ourselves as a country. You know, some of the things which have been celebrated most over the last 8 months or so have been things like, you know, national solidarity about clapping NHS workers, celebrating and recognising Captain Tom Moore and the fundraising efforts, and that showing how much people want to give to something, to be able to do something positive at a time where there's so much challenge and difficulty for them. So I think it shines a light more broadly, not just on the act of giving, but what that shows us about the kind of communities and people that we are and what we value. I'm imagining most people on this call aren't fundraisers. I'm not a fundraiser myself, so we're all in the same place. But I do work with charities and fundraisers every day. As a membership organisation, we have about 6,000 individual fundraisers from across the UK who work at around 3,000 different charities. And we also have about 600 charities who are members Chartered Institute. I'm not a fundraiser myself, but I have the benefit and the value of everybody across our membership interacting with them on a daily basis, telling us what's happening, understanding their needs and their challenges, understanding what's happening with donations at the moment as well. I would imagine most people here aren't fundraisers, but I would imagine that you are people that either work with fundraisers, that you maybe manage fundraisers, you may be trustees of organisations which have fundraising volunteers or have paid fundraisers as well. So hopefully what I will share is a broad picture of what fundraising and giving looks like at the moment, and may give you some pointers, some thoughts or some ideas which you may then want to share with colleagues or teams to help inform kind of steps that you take moving forward. So I think first of all, obviously, you know, the beginning of the emergency, the beginning of COVID around March and April, we saw a huge hit in terms of the impact on fundraising because of the number of events, the number of community fundraising activities, cash collections, public fundraising activities to, you know, inspire people to sign up for regular direct debits, fetes, runs, London Marathon, whatever they might be. We had to cancel or postpone a huge amount of activity. And that really did have an immediate hit in terms of fundraising income. So much of fundraising activity is predicated on being able to be with supporters or reach out to members of the public. And that has undoubtedly had a huge impact. We have seen that charities have launched emergency appeals and that they have pivoted and changed their approach. And actually, in a lot of cases, those emergency appeals have actually done well, and they've probably performed a little bit better than we expected. And what you might see today is some figures that have been released this morning from Charities Aid Foundation, who do a research project called UK Giving, which is a yearly piece of work, and it's based on asking people how much they have supported charities over the last 4 weeks, and it's run throughout the year. The report only came out this morning, so I haven't updated my slides. But what it's actually shown is that in the first 6 months of the pandemic, that there has been additional cash donations at a greater level than we have seen in previous years go through to charities. And that's what people are saying that they have donated. So it isn't a reconciliation of charity accounts. It isn't a definitive number based on reports to the Charity Commission on the amount of donations. It's a kind of very comprehensive piece of public research asking what people have said that they have given and how they have given it and to what kind of causes. But actually the positive message that I'm taking from it is when you ask people through the pandemic, have they thought about charities? Have they given to charities? What kind of charities and at what level have they given? The answers are charitable giving is more in our minds than it has been previously. The average gift amount has increased and people are more likely to say that they have donated this year during the first 6 months of the pandemic than they would have said in the previous years as well. And I think that is really important, both in terms of an indication of cash donations have done well. People's response to emergency appeals has been positive. And it also, again, shows us that it's in the public's mind.
Hi, Dan. It's Richard here again. What we'll do is we'll try and take some questions on the Q&A side. We'll give you a little bit of time to get back into the loop.
Okay, I'll do that now.
Thanks, Dan. We'll wait for Dan to come back into the loop, but if we have the opportunity for any questions and answers.
Hi, Richard. It's Claire from RBST. I think I've just been invited to ask my question.
Okay, Claire, come on.
Hi, yeah. So when we get Daniel back on the line, something that I would be interested in understanding a little more about is the link between what Daniel was just talking us through in terms of recent data published suggesting that additional cash donations have been being received. And obviously I appreciate that is based on what people are saying they've done, versus data that was actually prepared by the Institute of Fundraising and discussed at a webinar that they ran back in September, where they were actually saying that donations were significantly down. And indeed that many charities, they'd done a survey of over 450 charities, and that many charities were not expecting to be back to pre-crisis income levels for as long as 2 years. And I just wanted to understand a little bit more around that relationship, because they, on the face of it, appear to contradict each other. But potentially it's because individuals are donating more, but what has fallen away is the ability to do organised fundraising events. So that's something I'd be very interested to have Daniel's view on, if possible.
Hello, Daniel.
Hello.
Hello. That's perfect.
That's perfect. Right. So back to the kind of overall impact. What we are seeing is that across the board, charities say that they're likely to have about a £10 billion financial shortfall this year because of a range of, fundraising and trading activities that they're not going to be able to. Do. So that is a huge gap, a huge hole in terms of charity income. And obviously, you may be aware that the financial package which was announced from government to help support the charity sector was 750 million. So we've got 750 million compared with a £10 billion shortfall. And so we are facing a significant gap. That means that about 1 in 10 charities say that they may well need to close in the next 12 months. And that 1 in 5 say that they're unlikely to be able to deliver services adequately over Christmas. So we are seeing immediate challenge affecting beneficiaries, affecting our communities, affecting our people. and longer term issues around sustainability in the sector. I know that we are going to be talking later on around mergers, and that may well be a way that organisations want to go through. I saw this morning that Sparks are going to be merging with Great Ormond Street, so maybe some of that is accelerating and happening now. As I said, emergency appeals have done well. You know, most of them have been inspirational. They have been creative. What we have seen, I think, the most successful appeals are the ones which reflect the individual experience of supporters at the time that they get them. So what do I mean by that? So first of all, I think the things that people say in polling groups and focus groups around charities and income is, we want to see what work you are doing in terms of responding to coronavirus. So don't ignore it. Even if you're a charity which, you know, let's say you're an environmental charity, you know, which maybe doesn't have an immediate role in terms of responding to COVID-19, it still affects you, and donors want to see that. They want to be part of the solution. So you have to reflect that in your fundraising. You have to show that you recognise the current context, not just do your normal fundraising appeal. And again, some of the really the things that I've seen that charities do, which I think work really well, are the ones which reflect back the individual's personal situation. So British Red Cross have done some great online fundraising, digital fundraising, which, you know, are less about the Red Cross and more about the individual, and recognizing that people may well be stressed, anxious, concerned, have lost their jobs, be affected by coronavirus themselves, or who have had families and friends. Charities need to put the supporters at the heart of those appeals, not just we are in difficulty because of coronavirus. And I think those are the ones which have been seeing the best responses. And I think that kind of fundraising is really important, because it's not just about the transaction of the donation. Yes, that is part of it, but excellent fundraising, and part of why we say our mission is excellent fundraising for a better world, is not just because of the money that is raised that benefits the charities, but that it both provides a positive context for the individual, as well as deliver wider benefits for society, all through fundraising and donating. So when we've done research with YouGov and looked at how people respond to fundraising, almost 2/3 say, as well as donating to the cause, and as well as, you know, through having received a fundraising appeal or a newsletter or something, 2/3 of people say that they have taken additional positive actions beyond donating. So those are things like signed up to be a volunteer, finding out more information about health conditions, taking more steps to be environmentally friendly, signing a petition and joining a campaign. These are all things which happen because of fundraising. And that gives us a sense of community action. It gives us a sense of togetherness and positivity. It gives those people opportunities to get involved. And it also makes us feel better and more positive at a time of stress and isolation. So I think when we're thinking about fundraising, it's not just about the benefit to our charity, it's also the wider benefit to the individual and to society as a whole. And I think that's why it's so important that we keep fundraising. And even through difficult times and challenges, some people said at the beginning of coronavirus, well, is it right for charities to go out there and ask for donations at a time where everybody is suffering or under challenge? And actually the answer is yes. It doesn't detract from what's happening. It's additional and it's complementary. As I've said, are people still giving? So here are some links which you can have a look at afterwards. I've probably talked a bit about these already, so I'm not going to go through them in a lot of detail, and partly because I've lost time because of my technology issues. I've talked about the response to emergency appeals. The other thing that we have seen is that actually regular donors and loyal supporters are remaining pretty much as loyal as they have ever been, which I think is a really good sign as well. So although there was a increase in cancellations of direct debits from February to March, that stabilized really quickly, and actually there have been normal levels of direct debit cancellations and better than normal levels of direct debit cancellations through the summer. So what that is telling me is that people who are committed to give to charity, are regular supporters of charities, more than ever are sticking with those organisations. They aren't saying, well, I'm not sure how the future is going to be in the economy, I'm not sure about my job, and therefore I'm going to stop my donations now. And I think that's a really positive sign, and also a testament to the great fundraising that they will have received and the great kind of communications and stewardship that charities would have been giving them through the pandemic as well. So it's another kind of good thing to be thinking about, the fact that people are remaining loyal. But as I say, that's going to be difficult through a recession. We know that people are worried about their jobs, about their livelihoods, and we know that there is a direct correlation between level of household income and the amount that people can give. So we are going to have to think differently about the future. And we can't just take it as a given that people will always give and those loyal supporters will remain. So things that I think charities should be doing is being proactive around that. We know that financial hardship is a worry and a concern. And I think on a slide going forward here, I can show you that when people were asked if there is a recession, would you plan to stop any charitable donations? Around a fifth of people said yes, I probably would plan to do that, and that the people most likely to say yes are younger people, so people in the 18 to 24 or 25 to 34 bracket. So we know it's in people's minds. Therefore, let's reflect that in our fundraising and in our communications. Don't take it for granted, and let's not be ignorant of that. But let's put that in there to say, look, we know this is a really hard time for many of our supporters. We know that some of our most committed supporters won't be able to give as much as they may want to at this time. That's okay. You know, we don't want you to be stressed or worried about it. If you'd like to take a pause of your regular donation, here's how you can do it. If you feel that you need to reduce your direct debit, here's the options of how. We can reflect that in our fundraising. We can be proactive and preempt that. And I think that's what we're going to need to do through the next months ahead. Obviously, we don't know how deep and long this recession is going to be, but I think we need to look back at what happened during the 2007-8 financial crash and how giving responded then, because we did see a fall in donations. The total value of donations fell by about 11% in the kind of peak years of the last financial crash. And that was both a lower mean average value of donations and a slightly smaller proportion of people giving to charity. So we saw that average donations fell from about 33 to 31 pounds, and the proportion of people giving to charity slightly dropped from 56 to 54% of people. And that reflected, and that taken together left about a 10% decrease in the value of donations. So we know that there is going to be an impact. We can't assume that we're going to be able to fundraise at the same level through the recession that's coming. So we need to plan accordingly for that. And one of the big things that we need to look at is house prices, actually, because legacies are worth billions of pounds to the sector every year, and seeing what happens with house price inflation or house price crash is going to be really important. The analysis from Legacy Foresight suggests that legacy income is likely to fall somewhere between a bit at 4% and a sizable amount of 23% this year. So if you're an organisation that does rely heavily on legacies, then you are going to have to revise down what you may get from legacies over the year. And I think it's really important that we do look at those kind of macroeconomic trends and some thoughts and ideas on what that means for our planning and what that means for our forecasting. So some thoughts on the months ahead, because I'm going to wrap up and get to the questions. So the future is going to be challenging, but it isn't yet written and we can shape it. We have some positive signs. People have responded to emergencies. That's because of the fundraising that we have done and the generosity of people to give during a pandemic. But that isn't going to be the same as fundraising through a recession. We need to remember what works, the skills, the experience, the insight of your fundraisers. As I say, if you do work with fundraisers or you're a trustee of an organization with fundraisers, remember what works, and the skills and the experience that they have are what are going to be what get you through this challenging period. They will be adapting, they will be changing, but they do know what they're doing, and they are putting in place good plans to pivot, to do online events, to move everything into a virtual world, and plan for the return of community events or the return of events when we can do them. I think looking at Christmas giving is going to be really interesting. You know, it's a big time where people do get a significant amount of income, and whether we will see a continued generosity of giving from the public at Christmas, I think is going to be really interesting kind of bellwether about how we're doing. I would also say be mindful of what's happening out there and what people are telling us, not just in fundraising, but in the wider world. You know, if people are telling us that they are anxious and that they are stressed and that they are concerned about their jobs in, you know, attitudes to general research and public polling, then we need to be thinking about that in relation to they are our supporters. So let's think about how we reflect on that. People's views, there was an article this morning that I read that's saying that people's attitudes to welfare benefits was more generous now than it has been for the last 20 years. Again, that shows us that people are saying, actually, yes, we think that people do need support and that support does need to be at good levels. Those are people who are very much likely to also think that they may well give to charities as well. So we need to look outside of the charity prism and look at the charity prism as being part of a wider context, because our supporters aren't just charity supporters. They are people with families, they're people with jobs, they're people with wider concerns and different situations. And we need to think about them as a wider person, not just about the transaction element of they are somebody that gives us money. I guess the last thing to say is don't stop asking. Ask where you can. Nothing that we've seen really through the pandemic shows that people are agitated and don't think that it's right for charities to fundraise, but they are saying that you need to be relevant, that you need to be mindful, and that you need to be sensitive in how you do it. I've put a link here at the bottom of this slide, which is a piece of guidance that we did, which is freely available, which is all about how do you change around fundraising strategies and plans during the pandemic. So if you are thinking about what do we do over the months ahead, how do we put in place a different strategy, what are the things that we need to be thinking about, then it may well be worth having a look at that piece of guidance, that advice, and having discussions around a board table about what you do for the future. I'm going to take a breath now because I've spoken quite quickly for this last bit because I was trying to get through it. I hope that's been useful. Apologies for the technology. I'm very happy to I know we said this bit would stop at 11:45, Richard, but I'm very happy to stay on.
Don't worry about it. We've got flexibility within the timetable, and I think the comments that are coming through on the chat and also questions. I mean, just in terms of feedback, Rosie saying thanks, Daniel. I think one of the key things you said is we can definitely reframe our ask by including work we're doing as a response to COVID-19, and I think that was one of the things that came through very clearly. And I think the other thing that came through for me was to actually start building that idea of community of giving and that connection with people that may be donors, but also they will do other things if you've actually got them donating. So from a questions point of view, Jill Evans, you can tell she's an accountant because she's talking about financial return in terms of if you're a small charity and you're investing in fundraising costs, it's that sort of risk to a certain extent as to what kind of return you're going to get.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is a really hard one. So if you look across what charities spend on fundraising and generating voluntary income and what they get back across the sector, the figure tends to be around 4 to 1. So across the charity sector, you tend to get about £4 back for every pound that you invest in fundraising. Now that includes both salaries or paying for the costs of fundraisers, as well as the cost of delivering activity. So it's a great return. And if you're a trustee, or if you were a business at the moment and you were saying, well, what gives us kind of good returns, you'd say fundraising is one of the most profitable things at the moment. But obviously that's a return on normal business and normal terms, not necessarily what we will be seeing at the moment. The other things just to say is those figures are different for different types of fundraising. So the ROI for legacy fundraising is much higher. It's probably at around 50 or 100 to 1, if not more, because you might have minimal costs of legacy fundraising, but it just so happens that somebody ends up leaving you a big legacy and leaving you a house, and that kind of skews your figures. Yeah. But yeah, overall it's about 4 to 1. Depending on the type of activity, it will be different. So individual giving and community fundraising is probably more around kind of somewhere between 2.8 and 3.5. Other types of fundraising give you a greater return, but then, it may well be that some of those people where the return is slightly lower, where it's a community fundraising event or an individual giving, somebody who's given, £3 a month, they might be somebody who leaves a legacy down the line, and then the results all get much better. So I think these are all kind of indicative figures and not to be, kind of definitively planned on, but maybe might help give some idea.
If it's an area where people don't feel they have the expertise in that respect, or they might traditionally be doing a little bit of low-level fundraising through events and stuff like that, how do they know whether they're going to get a good fundraiser? And I suppose this sort of feeds back into the sort of Chartered Institute, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and nothing is a science around this, but there are a lot of indicators. And when we have worked with smaller charities, I guess, what we have seen is that if you're a charity who hasn't ever had a fundraiser before, and you bring one in, it works. We have seen that investment in fundraising does return benefit and value to the organisation over and above the costs of the activity. However, there is a challenge at the moment, which is obviously, charities are having to be very mindful about planning for the future. They may, not want to be signing off on what may seem like significant long-term costs of fundraising at a time where they may also be having to make very difficult decisions about service delivery as well. So there's a number of things to think about, but the picture across the board is that if you can invest in fundraising, it works, and it has worked for the last, 30 plus years in terms of charities raising much more than they have spent on the delivery of activity.
There's some questions coming through as well in terms of, I think, coming back to the idea of sort of pivoting. So they may have had a traditional way of doing things, and how do they pivot? So there was the link through to that guidance from the institute. But a couple of things we've got here are sort of door-to-door collections and Santa sleigh collections and stuff like that, as to how they, do they still go ahead, or can we, or do we need to adapt those?
So is that a question more on kind of physically, are those kind of activities able to happen?
I think yeah, it's probably a balance between whether they should be going ahead, and if not, how do we still sustain that money, perhaps in a different form?
Sure. So I think at the moment, very few charities are putting on face-to-face kind of activities and events. We are working actually at the moment with government and Public Health England and the fundraising regulator to publish guidance around what can charities do around community and fundraising events, and how can they do it safely and in line with COVID secure kind of processes and policies. But I think planning them at the moment this side of Christmas is going to be difficult. I wouldn't say it's absolutely impossible, but I would probably caution about trying to put on too much this side of Christmas. And I think that's a mix of everything's changing with tiers and different restrictions coming in, and anything that you plan with is going to have to be planned with so much caveat and uncertainty in it that it maybe is too difficult to put on. The other thing which I think we need to be slightly mindful of, it's not just a matter of, well, can we put on an event? It's, would people want to come to it at the moment, and would it be successful? So I think from that point of view, I'd probably, at the moment, I'd be planning to do things more next side of Christmas rather than this side. I think we probably can do some kind of cash collections. And there have been, at the moment, there is public fundraising happening. And we've seen some good indications that people are giving in those circumstances. Again, everybody would need to follow, the right guidance to make sure that social distancing was maintained, and that everything, that if you were giving any, kind of information out or materials out, that it was all kind of had hand sanitizer all over it and so on. So I think I would say only do it if you could be pretty, more than pretty confident. You could be sure that you could do it in a way which anybody that you're coming into contact with would be reassured that you are doing things safely and responsibly, because there is a huge risk about it as well, both in terms of individual health, but your risk on your reputation as well. So yeah, I mean, and I guess the opportunities of what you can do differently would be around looking at, digital and online stuff in the main, probably. I wouldn't, so as I said, Poppy Appeal have gone digital. We're seeing organisations planning, kind of Christmas carol concerts by Zoom. That kind of thing would be, are great if you can do them. The other things to say is that don't forget some of the traditional stuff that maybe people have shied away from over the last years. We're seeing that, responses through direct mail is going really well. Telephone fundraising has had a resurgence in terms of people responding well to telephone calls and having a chat. Maybe that's because they're speaking to fewer people in a day-to-day life and they're a bit bored at home. Pick up the phone to supporters, have a chat with them as well. Not everything has to be lots of money and digital and look, flashy and creative. It can just be a phone call.
That's fantastic. That's really, really good. And we're getting some good comments coming back through on the chat side. So Dan, thank you very much. And that was really, really interesting. I think the big thing from my point of view, or the messages that I've taken away from that, is that there is still a desire for people to help charities. And I think the main thing is from a strategic point of view, how the trustees and how the executive teams are perhaps pivoting how they can best connect with those people. And I think necessarily the framing of the whole of it within COVID-19, as to your particular response, I think is a really, really good point. Thanks, Dan. Thanks very much indeed.
All right. Cheers.
Brilliant. Okay, so that's sort of set the scene in terms of change for charities. So I've been your host so far, but just to sort of paint a little bit of picture of who I am. My name is Richard Miller. I met a lot of you before through TSSG, but for those people for their first time, I'm the strategic services partner at Daffins, and I help a lot of commercial companies, but also have a very large portfolio of charities and not-for-profits. And one of the things that we've been talking about, and Dan has been focused on, is the need perhaps to start doing things differently. So the focus for the next 20 minutes or so is going to be, how as a charity do we embrace the change that we need, and how we're going to adapt. So again, what I'll do is we'll have a presentation for about a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes, and then we'll open up. So in terms of what we want to cover, we'll have Q&A at the end. I'd like to cover a little bit about COVID-19, how we have been able to progress through the crisis, what we call a roadmap. We'll talk a bit about going back to basics. So what is the why for our charity? What is it that we are set up to achieve? We'll talk about then the capabilities with regard to adaptability and agility that we need as organizations. And then we'll finish off with a little bit on change success. If we're going to invest some time and effort in bringing about change, how do we ensure that for the effort we put in, we get the return that we need? So let's kick off with the roadmap to the crisis. All the people we've been talking to in our experience is that the COVID-19 crisis has sort of been broken down into 3 phases. The first phase was survival. What do we need to do as an organisation to actually ensure that we survive? So a lot of that was to do in terms of, restricted income. The level of donations might have gone down. We may have had a service grant, but can we actually meet the criteria for delivering that? Do we need to batten down the hatches? Some people were talking about sort of effectively freezing the charity down in aspic and that kind of stuff. And so that was just reacting to circumstances. Everybody talking about coronavirus, business interruption loan schemes and furloughing. I seem to remember when we were doing the weekly catch-ups on TSSG, were very much to the fore. But now, if you have survived, we're now entering, or we're in the phase of what we call pivot and adapt. We all want to get to the third phase, which effectively is how do we continue to thrive as a charity? But it could be that we just don't go back the way that we used to do things. It might be in the medium term that we need to actually adapt the model that we have from an operational point of view. And that involves everybody within the charity. That's the trustees and the executive teams themselves. So we'll be focusing in the next few minutes in terms of how do we actually pivot and adapt. The first thing is to go back to the why. Simon Sinek says you've always got to start with why. And in some respects, charitable organisations have an advantage over commercial organisations because a charity is set up to achieve a particular purpose. And so each of your charitable organisations will have a charitable purpose. And what we're saying to people is you need to perhaps just have a pause and go back to what your purpose is. You may have developed over a period of time a means of actually delivering whatever that purpose is. So we may have developed a delivery model. We're saying, okay, we've got certain services and products that we offer. We may have a number of projects. We may be a project-driven charity. So we're running a number of projects which will then deliver the impact. And what is the impact we're making? And it all comes down to beneficiaries. The reason we exist is to bring impact to our beneficiaries. And now is an opportunity to actually step back to say, in the current environment and also in the future adaptation of our organisation, what is the way that we can bring maximum impact to our beneficiaries? Now, part of that is a funding model, which Dan has focused on in the first session. So how are we going to pay for that? What is our charitable income? Where is it coming from? Looking at grants, and also one of the conversations I've had very frequently with people is in terms of the level of reserves. People to a certain extent may have felt that they shouldn't be keeping a high level of reserves, but ultimately the policy, if you're keeping a level of reserves now, might mean that you have the ability to sustain the organisation in the medium to short term. And then there's the operational model. How do we actually organise ourselves? What are the structures we have in place? Do we have branch structures? Do we use volunteers? Or are we mainly an employment base? What resources are we using, people and other? And what systems and processes do we have? And in times of constraint, often it's a time to actually have a look at a waste within the organisation. Are we as efficient as we could be? Or is there a different way of actually reaching the objectives and impact upon our beneficiaries? So go back, take a pause, go back to the why for your charity. The next thing I want to talk about is adaptability. Often misquoted is Charles Darwin, often misquoted as the survival of the fittest, and it isn't. It is the quote is, it is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is the most adaptable to change. So the question then arises for your organisation, what is it that you need to do to adapt to ensure that you get into that final phase of the recovery, which is the thrive? So what is it that you need to do to adapt? Now, with regard to the question of adaptability, often when we're running workshops and the like, we tap into different resources. We often use Harvard Business Review, or there's very good stuff on NCVO. This one here is one of the TED Talks, and we often use TED Talks. They're nice sort of bite-sized bits of learning. And This is one from a lady called Natalie Fratto. And Natalie Fratto in her day-to-day job is effectively somebody who is there to identify high potential growth businesses that are looking for venture capital funding. And you might say to yourself, well, what does commercial business and startups got to do with me as a not-for-profit organization? Well, actually, what you're finding is in some cases, people are having to adopt a kind of startup mentality, because the idea of a startup is that you've got to create a sustainable operational model, and you've got to do that afresh. And so therefore, you need to ensure that your organization is as adaptable as it can be. Now, Natalie talks about 3 ways that you can actually measure how adaptable your organization is. And she talks about her experience, and when she's trying to identify people that should receive funding, she asked the question in terms of, well, how do we identify those people? Are we looking for the people with the highest IQ, their intelligence quotient, or increasingly over the last few years or so, we've been talking very much about EQ, emotional intelligence, the ability to actually connect with people and also bring them with you. But she effectively says that there's a third element here, which is the adaptability quotient. And what she's saying is that we shouldn't actually be thinking about past experience. What you're looking to do is identify people in a mindset where we have the ability to meet future uncertainty head on, and that we have that ability to scenario plan, so that effectively, when we come across something, we have the mindset and the ability to do something. So that's the first thing, which is the sort of what if scenario. And when we were running a number of workshops at the end of 2019, we could have done some what if scenarios. And one of them might have been, what if we're hit by a global pandemic? But I think the problem is that's gone beyond a what if scenario at this particular point in time. The second thing she talks about is an interesting one, which is called the concept of unlearning. And what tends to happen is that over a period of time as an organization, we've adopted a certain way of doing things that is successful and therefore is held as our fixed model. Or it might be there are certain held wisdoms to say this is the way that we do it, and this is what's going to be successful, and this is what's not going to be successful. She's saying that if you want to be truly adaptable, you need to unlearn those things that you thought were the truth and were the only things to do things. So we often talk about Carol Dweck, who's an educational psychologist, and she talks about different mindsets, making the distinction between what we call a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. And people with a fixed mindset tend to be happy with the knowledge and the self-gratification they get, is in terms of the way that they have of knowledge and a certain way of doing things. And they don't tend to like change. She's saying what you need to do is adapt a growth mindset, which is always open to new ideas. And so it's a question of being open to change. So you need to ask yourself, how much is our organization and the people who operate within it open to change? How much do we have a growth mindset? And the last thing she talks about is that if you really want to be adaptable, you need to have this ability to explore innovation and new opportunities. And in the past, you might have seen new opportunities and you might have said to yourself, well, actually, our existing business model is giving us the best return, so therefore we don't need to do anything. What she's saying is that you need to embrace innovation. Now, one of the interesting things is that if you're talking outside an organization, like the idea of you being innovative. But innovation, if you talk to the people within an organization, they may be scared stiff by the term. So somehow you need to demystify and make sure that innovation isn't something that is threatening to your internal team. What does innovation mean to someone within the team? They may say, well, you're asking me to do something with perhaps no chance of return and I'm going to fail. So you need to be open to innovation. And you need to ensure that you're sharing those ideas. And we'll come on to talk about how you might test those ideas moving forward. So I really recommend that. You've got a link through to the presentation, but it's a question of how adaptable is your organization, and on those measures that Natalie Fratto talks about, perhaps just do a bit of a gap analysis. The other interesting article that I'll point you towards is, this was actually released in the Harvard Business Review back in June 2020. So this was actually after we were in the coronavirus crisis. And it was entitled 3 Things You're Getting Wrong About Organizational Change. And the main thrust of the actual article itself was that effectively we had certain fixed ways of doing things, certain broad assumptions that if you want to bring about change, this is the way to do it. And the author here says, well, actually, we need to flip those assumptions. And she gives 3 assumptions that you need to throw out the window and flip them. And the one I want to focus on here is what she calls flip number 2. And the held assumption was, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And she's saying you need to flip that to, let's just fix it anyway. So the idea is that as an organization, we need to be open to change stuff. The idea of continuous improvement. Don't just sit back on your laurels as to something that's worked. Embrace that idea that you can be adaptable as an organization, and you can actually work on those incremental improvements to how you do things. So we've talked through adaptability. Agility, I think, is going to be the key thing. People talk about agility. It's been very much the fore over the last 3 to 5 years, I suppose, but it's really a term that has actually come to the fore, particularly during the COVID crisis. So what I'd like to do is talk you through what I mean by agility and the kind of things that you might try and do to ensure that your organization is as agile as possible. So let's start with the definition. Agility, the definition I use is the ability to quickly respond and adapt changing needs and demands, but whilst minimizing risk. So that's the first one, is quickly responding. So we have the ability to quickly respond, but also minimizing the risk for the organization. And I was doing a charity presentation last week, and I was asked by the chair of trustees as to, they are very, very big in terms of minimizing risk. And as I said to the chair at the time, you always have a choice as an organization. You can choose to do nothing. And I can't say whether that's right or wrong. But you can also choose to do something, but also minimize the risk by ensuring that the return you get is measured and that you're open to adapt. So I'll come on to talk about that. So in terms of agility, there was some research done by McKinsey's. This is a 2015 article that appeared in the Harvard Business Review. And it seemed to be slightly counterintuitive, the findings they had. The name of the article was Agility, it rhymes with stability. And what they said is that if you want to be a truly agile organization, not only do you need the dynamic capability, so those are we often say that operational capability is the ability to do what we do on a day-to-day basis, whereas the dynamic capability is our ability to change the way what we do on a day-to-day basis. So they said, as well as needing that dynamic capability to bring about change, you also need what they call a stable backbone. You need those strong foundations. You need the ability, not only from a financial point of view, but you need the learning and development. You need the ability and the processes to actually, if you want to bring about change, how are we going to do it in a fixed way? So think about those 2 things. And I think the fear is, to a certain extent, is that certain charities may have cut back costs, but if that cuts back on their stability, their stable backbone, it could mean that they're not as agile as they could be to respond. So I'll put a link through to that article anyway. So what a lot of organizations will then need to do is say, okay, if I understand the idea of agility, how do I bring about that change within my own organization? So these are just a few observations, and I apologize if it's a bit of a busy slide, but I'll talk you through. What we're finding is that agile organizations tend to be flatter and less hierarchical than other organizations. So we're moving away from the old, what I'd call command and control, where you have decisions and strategy being decided at top level and effectively just being fed back down, telling people what to do, and then praising them if they get it right, or telling them off if they don't. Agile organizations tend to have a flatter structure. They tend to break through silos, and if they're working on change within an organization, they tend to have smaller, self-organizing, so they have their own accountability and their own decision-making process, and also their own budget. Cross-functional teams, so you're actually drawing people with expertise and skill sets from within the organization. Because if you're going to bring about change, it's going to impact all parts of those organizations. So therefore, it's best to actually involve everybody. The other thing from an agile organization is that they are always focused on the needs of the customer, or the needs of the user, or the needs of the beneficiary. Because ultimately, it comes back to this idea of what is our why? How do we bring most impact to the beneficiary? So agile organizations and the teams that they build will always have someone who is very much focused on what is our service, what is our product, what is our deliverable, and making sure that we pick those things that will bring greatest impact. So I work with a number of people on what we call Scrum teams, and so one person is called the product owner, and that person is the eyes and ears of the user, or the eyes and ears of the beneficiary within the organization, and they're the ones that decide what the priorities are that we actually start working on. The other key thing that comes out of agility is Pareto, 80-20. The idea is that if this comes back to the idea of minimizing risk. So the idea is that if you're going to launch a new product or a service, build something quickly and create what we call a minimum viable product, something that you could potentially launch and get out there and test. Now, the reason you would get it out there and test it is that you then invested not too much time and money in actually getting something to the marketplace, or to the charitable marketplace, but also you can learn as you go, and you haven't committed too much in the way of the funds that you need. The other thing is that you don't necessarily need to build a perfect product or a perfect service. Often you'll find that if you judge it internally, you're looking for greater perfection than actually your user or your beneficiary needs. So if you can spend 20% on something that gives you 80% of the impact, and 80% is good enough, then run with that. The other thing is, from an agile organization, is that ability to inspect and adapt. It's what Eric Ries called to build, measure, learn loop. So you launch quickly, you build something, you test it, and then you learn. And the idea being is that you decide as to, okay, is it working? Let's persevere along these lines, or if not, let's pivot to something else. And what tends to happen within agile organizations is that you have a series of what we call time boxes, what often we call sprints. So rather than actually saying we've got 3 months to do this, what you'll do is you'll have a series of sprints, which may be a week, 2 weeks, maybe a month. And the idea is for each of those sprints, at the end of it, that we should have something where we built an increment of value. At the end of that sprint, effectively, you have a sprint review. And what is the sprint review? It's a bit like a show and tell. So the project team gets together, and we also get stakeholders. So the stakeholders may be beneficiaries, either present or past beneficiaries. They may be funders, people who are looking to perhaps fund a particular project, get them involved, get them as part of the learning process. And the idea is at the end of that sprint, you then ask the question is this increment that we've developed, is it capable of launch? And then the final thing then is the learning process, which is the retrospective. What have we learnt? What will we do differently next time? What impediments need to be removed? So that's a real sort of whistle stop through what may be an agile kind of framework. Part of it is mindset. Part of it is that it's creating a structural framework to allow it to happen within your charity. So that's the positive stuff. What's the downside? The downside is that research tells us that there is only a 30% probability that any change initiative that we launch will succeed. Now, 30% came from research probably about 2 or 3 years ago. The latest research shows that it may be as low as 25%. So what we suggest you do is that if you want to try and minimize your potential failure and the cost that it's going to bring you in terms of the time and effort you've put in, the impact in terms of your confidence if it doesn't work out, the wasted money, and you can't underestimate the emotional energy that people will put into it. That if it doesn't succeed, it's got to be more than a trial and error approach. So what we will do with people is we have a change success model, and the change success model says, okay, before we start with the change, let's have a quick pause and try and assess at an early stage what's our probability of change success. And it'll then allow you to score those areas where perhaps your probability of change success may not be as high as it could be. But if it's identified areas that you may need to work on, then it's worthwhile spending a little bit of time and effort doing that first to increase that probability. So the main areas we'll have a look at are change readiness. Is the organization ready for change? Capability. Does the organization have the skill set, and do the people within the organization have the skill set to bring about change? And the last one is beliefs. Questions and answers. Any particular questions that people have, I'm happy to take those. Hello, Claire.
Hi, Richard. Thanks for taking another question. This is more a comment. So first of all, thank you for that, because I think at least over this period of time, for my experience, we've been so busy sort of firefighting, we don't always have a chance to step back and do this.
Yeah.
And I can see the logic in kind of everything that you reference. Is there a particular, maybe insight or way that small resource-strapped charities can try and do this in a little bit more quickly? So I think one thing in particular we struggle with in terms of being agile and making better decisions and making sure that everyone's been involved in that is that's a huge amount of resource to dedicate to kind of having those discussions. Is there, how can we maybe find like a sort of a happy medium in terms of bringing people with us and being agile whilst not having everyone in the organization, I don't know, away from their desks for large periods of time?
Yeah, and I think that the first thing I'll say there is that there needs to be a certain question as to the scope of what the charity can achieve, and I think part of that is going back to the basics, to say what is it that we're designed to achieve and what is the way that we can actually reach people. Now, a couple of things that I'm attempting to use with charitable trustees at the moment. The first one is, and what I don't want people to do is go through a long, detailed exercise. That's completely, being agile is you've got to try and identify what the priorities are at an early stage and then get commitment. So the kind of things I'm tempted to do with people, the first one is what we call blank canvas thinking. And blank canvas thinking is just sitting down with the trustees and the exec team and saying, okay, forget about how we've set this charity up in the past. If we are starting a new charity with the knowledge that we have, how would we do it? And it could be that you with that idea that you don't have the constraints of or the lens of looking through the past. The idea is that if I were to set up the charity afresh, how would I structure it? How many people would I have? Where would my funding come from? What is, if I have a membership model, how do I communicate with the members? How do I start looking for grant income and stuff like that? So I think that's always a breath of fresh air, because sometimes people feel constrained by the organisation that they're operating within at present. So blank canvas is a great one. And the idea is that if you've identified things, there are no right or wrong answers there. They're just opinions. And so all you're trying to do is get a feeling for, where are the areas you may need to change. The other exercise I do with people is what we call deconstruct and reconstruct. And the idea being is that the charity over a period of time it probably started off relatively simple, but then as it grew, it developed layers and layers and layers of different things. And so perhaps became quite complex and is offering a multitude of things to the charitable marketplace. And so the question you ask is, if as a charity we could only do one thing to bring maximum impact, and you can only do one thing, what would that one thing be? And that might be a little bit of argument amongst the charitable trustees, but just choose one thing, and then you say, okay, to do that one thing, how do we actually structure the organisation to do that? And once you've got that, you then say, okay, if we want to build on other services and offerings and deliverables, we need to be able to justify the additional impact for the time, effort, and cost of delivering that additional item. And so it means that you're then using some kind of judgment to assess A, whether you have the funds to do it, and B, whether it's worthwhile doing that. And I think part of it is maybe just looking at revising your scope. It might be for a shorter period of time. Now, I appreciate that if you've got a service contract, if you're one of those charities that have a service contract, you may not have a chance to reduce your scope or amend your scope. Having said that, in the early part of the crisis, there was a diktat given out to public sector organisations to make sure that they were open to change if service providers did come back to them, and perhaps there was some kind of change in terms of the deliverables and targets and stuff like that. So keep it simple. Just try one or two key things.
Okay, lovely. I'll definitely. I think we might ask a couple of those questions then at our next board meeting, and just see what gets thrown back. So thanks for that, Richard. Really appreciate it.
I'd be pleased to get some feedback as to whether that works or not. So we now move into the last speaker session of the day, and we have Brian Jukes, corporate tax partner at Daffins, and we have Mark Lewis, who's senior charities partner at Lodder Solicitors, on the topic of mergers and collaborative workings.
I will fire away and see how the technology works. So I'll just introduce myself very briefly. Richard already has, thank you. But also, alongside being corporate tax partner, I'm also responsible for all things charities, charity tax, I should say, within Daffins. We have a strong charity and not-for-profit client base, so my expertise in that field has strengthened year on year, and so yes, I've had to get to grips with many aspects of charity tax, which is good fun. So this particular session is designed to look at one particular area of charities' strategic planning. Richard has already introduced the concept of strategic planning generally. This is one area where charities might want or need to focus in order to make their cost base smaller, basically. We're looking at collaborative working, mergers, and other similar structures. The question that you have to start with in these very strange times is your charity financially viable on its own? All charities have to be financially managed on a responsible basis. They have to have a reserves policy, and they have to publish that reserves policy. I could talk at length about reserves policies, as you might imagine, and Richard too, but I won't. I'll save that for another day. If you've considered that question and decided, yes, you are financially viable, but you're still struggling, then you'll be looking at the extra fundraising, which Dan has talked to us about this morning. But that may not be an avenue that's particularly lucrative just at the moment. And so you've exhausted that particular avenue. And so you're looking at your cost base. Or indeed, you're looking at reducing your services that you're providing to your beneficiaries. Obviously, that's not something any charity ever wants to do. That's unpalatable. So the alternative is to reduce the cost base. But how can this be done without compromising the charity's delivery objective? Well, that's what we want to go on to talk about today. There are a number of different structures that you might consider in order to share costs with another friendly charity that you might happen to know and you've started talks with, and you're looking at how to collaborate in the most viable method, with the most viable methodology. So Mark, can I pass over to you to talk through in a bit more detail those cost sharing methodologies?
Thanks, Brian. And as you just said, you have to find a like-minded charity with which to pool the resources. And once you've done that, the first consideration is the legal issues which might arise. The main one of which is how to structure the arrangements. There is no one size fits all. Much depends on the types of charity, their objects, and if there are any restrictions attaching to particular types of assets. So the second bullet point on the slide there, charity commission approval. Charity commission approval may or may not be required. Each case is different. It may be necessary to obtain charity commission approval to change the objects or to enable the assets to be transferred, because for one reason or another, it is not considered that there is the power to transfer the assets from one charity to another, or to deal with complications caused by permanent endowment property. So there can be a number of reasons why you have to go to the Charity Commission, but you don't always have to go to the Charity Commission. And then, of course, there are tax issues, and Brian's going to chip in here, I think.
Yeah, can I jump in there? It's a common misconception, of course, that charities are exempt from tax. They do have lots of reliefs from tax, that is true, but far from being exempt. One particular area where charities can trip over is VAT. If you're in certain cost sharing models, then you might find that the VAT cost is actually increased rather than being diminished. So you're defeating yourself to some extent. So we'll talk about tax issues to some extent.
And then, of course, the cultural issues, which are very important. There are lots of different types of charity, from charitable trusts without members to unincorporated associations with members, charitable incorporated associations with or without members, and also, of course, companies limited by guarantee. So a variety of different legal vehicles which may or may not, which may have to be amalgamated, and with the cultural issues associated with each. And of course, individuals. Do the two charities fit together? And that's likely to be an overriding consideration. And one of the main reasons, as we were just looking at, for the restructuring is likely to be to reduce the need for certain resources. And of course, that will lead to difficult decisions may lead to difficult decisions with regard to possible redundancies. So what are the different options available to you? Well, there are a variety of options which we can have a look at. First of all, we've got a collaboration agreement. And this may be an end in itself, or it may be a precursor to a full-blown merger. Then we've got the takeover route, under which one charity takes over another. And then thirdly, we've got the merger route, whereby there is a more equal restructuring. Although with this route, it's always likely that there will be a dominant charity. But in terms of the choice between a takeover and a merger is a more equal way of achieving the restructuring. And then finally, a group structure, which is a structure designed to achieve tax benefits without actually constituting a merger. So looking first at collaborative working, this is likely to achieve the shared services of administration and overheads, and it has the advantage that it maintains the separate identities of the two charities and the separate trustees. So it's not a takeover and it's not a merger, and the two charities can stay the same. It must further the objects of each of the two charities, and it must be in their best interests. And it's always sensible to carry out due diligence to make sure that the parties are comfortable with one another and to make sure that there are no unforeseen pitfalls. It's necessary to clearly define and agree the extent of the collaboration, and it could be dealt with in a variety of ways. There could be a mutual services agreement whereby both parties provide services to each other, or there could be a management or services agreement with one party providing the services to the other, or it could simply be a memorandum of understanding, which is not legally binding, but with services provided on an ad hoc basis. So depending upon which route is chosen, it could be relatively simple to implement. And of the 3 choices or 4 choices which I've just been talking about and which we're looking at, it is most likely the simplest to implement. And I would emphasize that it is a precursor, can be a first stage, and very often is, to a more full-blooded merger. However, there are particular tax inefficiencies with regard to cross charges, and I don't know if you want to say something about that, Brian.
Thanks, Mark. Yes, can I jump in there? As Mark says, this is the simple option, but unfortunately there is a sting in the tail related to VAT. If you've got 2 or even just 1 VAT registered charity involved in a collaboration agreement, then that charity is going to have to charge VAT on any costs that it cross charges to the other charity. And sadly, charities are very often either partially exempt or unable to recover VAT at all. And therefore that VAT is going to represent a real cost to the other charity. We'll go on to look at that in a bit more detail shortly.
Thanks, Brian. So moving on to takeovers, the next method of restructuring. So under this, it's possible that the one charity, which is the dominant charity, will need to expand its objects to take over the activity of the other. This may or may not be necessary. And if it is necessary to change the objects, then that will almost certainly require charity commission involvement. And as the name suggests, with a takeover, one of the charities may disappear, but not necessarily. It may remain as a shell charity. There might be reasons for that, for example, to make sure that it continues to receive legacies going forward. If there are legacies to a charity, then you wouldn't wish to lose those, and it might be a reason to maintain the charity as a shell charity. And also there may be permanent endowment property, which may mean that it's not possible to transfer the property of the servient charity to the dominant charity. So for that reason as well, it may be necessary to retain the servient charity as a shell charity. And then the 3rd bullet point there on the slide, the rebranding required. Well, this can be a major source of difficulty, and indeed sometimes can be a reason why it's not even possible to take the whole process further forward because of concerns over what this might lead to. But rebranding is obviously a major aspect which would need to be considered. And then previous funders of the disappearing charity might object. So of course, with regard to the disappearing charity, it's necessary to ensure that any funding continues, and there has to be consultation with the funders to make sure that they're happy to continue providing funding to the dominant charity, the charity which is doing the taking over. And then there needs to be the transfer of assets, the final bullet point there, from the one charity, the disappearing charity, to the charity which is doing the taking over. So we need to ensure that this is permitted by the governing document of the disappearing charity. It needs to have the necessary power. And if it doesn't have the necessary power, it may be necessary for Charity Commission approval to be given to enable this to happen, or an order of the Charity Commission. There may be other reasons why the Charity Commission approval is required, as I mentioned, changing the objects, and also dealing with permanent endowment property, which can be an issue. And then there will need to be a transfer resolution approving the transfer. And then in the case of an unincorporated association with a membership, it may be that we're taking advantage of the dissolution clause in the constitution of the of the unincorporated association, and there will need to be a winding up resolution passed, which will need to be approved by the members and dealt with very often in a very particular way. And then the last but one point there, the transfer agreement, which is often required, and a variety of considerations which relate to that. Contracts to be transferred, employees to be transferred, the transfer of undertakings regulations, identifying liabilities passing across, data protection, and a whole host of issues which might arise, which will need to be covered in the transfer agreement. And then finally, SDLT relief on property. So Brian, do you want to say something about that?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah. The important point to make here is that charities are exempt from stamp duty generally on the transfer of property, but it's not something that is automatic. It has to be claimed. So the point I'm making here is don't forget it. There are many things that you'll have to consider if you're going down this path, and tax is one that often gets forgotten. So please don't. Stamp duty relief has to be claimed.
Thanks, Brian. And the next form of restructuring is a merger with two or more charities transferring their activities to a new charity. So this is a more equal way of achieving the objective. And in order to do this, as you can see, there has to be a new charity. So a new charity has to be formed. Both of the original charities may disappear, but there again, they may not for the reasons that I mentioned a little earlier. And there will, of course, be rebranding, which is obviously often a contentious issue, particularly with larger charities. And then once again, the previous funders of both charities might object. So that needs to be looked into and examined quite carefully. The legal complications is caused by the transfer of the assets of both charities. So those complications are doubled up as opposed to a simple takeover, because there are two transfers of assets from the two charities to the new charity. So there are similar considerations to a takeover, but essentially times two. One advantage of this route is that the objects of the new charity can be all embracing, so they will cover the objects of both of the charities being taken over. So that is an advantage. I would say that in practice, this merger route is not one that I often see. I do see it from time to time. The route which is most often chosen is the takeover route. And there is, of course, the final route structure route, which we're going to come to in a moment. But first of all, we're going to have a look at issues affecting both takeovers and mergers.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Of course, you've got to start by the trustees looking at these possible restructuring routes to consider, is it in the best interests of both charities and indeed the beneficiaries of those charities. This is the due diligence that Mark's referred to already, and I can't emphasize enough how important that due diligence is. There is a very helpful 20 questions document that the Charity Commission have produced, which I'm going to quickly flick up on screen. This is something that is in the public domain, so anyone can go and find this. Google is a fantastic thing. It will find this for you if you put the right question in. But this is something that any trustees considering either a merger or a takeover, or indeed even a collaboration agreement, but particularly the former, need to go through. It's asking those questions that will seem obvious, but until you actually go through this list, you won't necessarily automatically think of all these things, and they are all important. So please do start with this resource.
Brian, can I just chip in there and make two quick points? You mentioned about finding that charity commission resource on Google. Dare I say it, it can be easier to find charity commission resources sometimes using Google rather than the charity commission website itself.
Yes, yes, indeed.
And so far as the checklist is concerned, I would advise that you look at this at an early stage. It does enable you to make sure, hopefully, that nothing is overlooked. And with regard to all of these forms of restructuring, the devil is in the detail and also the planning. And an awful lot of planning is required.
Yes, indeed. As Mark's referred to already, are the objects of the two charities compatible? That's a question you have to start with. If they're not, then you are going to have to change the objects of one or the other, or formulate new objects for a new charity. And consultation is so important. It's not just consulting amongst the trustees or between the trustees of the two charities, or consulting with your own employees. It's consulting beyond it to the outside world with the beneficiaries and the service users. Some charities are, of course, membership organizations, so you'll need to consult with your members. And never forget the funding organizations that might be the lifeblood of the charities. They need to be part of this discussion too. Mark, do you want to just quickly talk about some of the pitfalls and the complications that this route will lead you down?
Yes, thanks, Brian. I think one cannot overemphasize how time-consuming the negotiations can be, and how time-consuming it can be to go through the various stages that are involved, not least because if it's necessary to involve the charity commission to form a new charity or to obtain a charity commission order in relation to some of the things we've been talking about, that can be a very lengthy process. It can take many months very often. It's also worth mentioning that so far as pitfalls are concerned, there are psychological issues associated with the various individuals involved very often. Not least that if there is a takeover, then effectively the disappearing charity is effectively, as is stated here, voting for its own extinction, which can be a very difficult thing to accept. So far as the transfer of the assets is concerned, that can sometimes be difficult as well, identifying the assets and in particular identifying the liabilities. So the charity which is taking over the assets and liabilities of the disappearing charity will want to have some clarity with regard to what exactly it is that is being taken over. And then finally, so far as the consultation with the stakeholders is concerned, there may be contracts with particular funding organisations, for example, which either need to be transferred or novated into the charity which is taking over in the case of a takeover. So there are quite a lot of issues and quite a lot of considerations, and you want really to make sure very carefully that you have a dedicated group within each charity which is actually dealing with the issues as and when they arise and planning very carefully.
And Mark, I'm sure you'll agree that bearing in mind trustees are voluntary posts, it's very difficult to get trustees to really commit the time that a merger or a takeover needs. And in my experience, mergers will take a very long time. They will suck up time, and they will go over and more than 1 year. I would put forward. So these are not things to be undertaken lightly, but they can be successful. But there are alternatives. The collaboration agreement is one that we've already outlined, and if I may now go on to another alternative, the group structure. This is something that could work for you if you have limited company charities. that are talking to each other and considering cost sharing. It's like a collaboration agreement, but it goes a bit further in terms of the two charities creating a legal entity structure. And the reason for this is to get over the VAT problem that I outlined earlier on the collaboration agreement. So what happens is we form a new parent charity, which is the charity where costs are shared. That's the entity within which costs are shared. And by virtue of a particular quirk of VAT legislation, you can make that parent charity a member of the two existing charities, which allows us to then form a VAT group, a grouping of those three charities for VAT purposes only. And that VAT group then allows you to cross-charge between any members of that group without having to apply VAT. Hence, you're saving that particular tax. Now, the beauty of a group structure is that the existing charities can remain. They carry on as they are, exactly as they are, except with a new parent. They retain their identity, no need to transfer assets from one to the other or from one to another. And the trustees carry on exactly as they were before. There will, however, need to be a change of legal constitution of both charities to enable this group structure to be put in place. So it's not something that is without cost. It's not something that can be just pushed in very quickly and easily without having to consider what you might be actually entering into. The trustees still need to do their due diligence, but at a lower level. But of real importance here, the Charity Commission won't be a concern. We won't need to consult with the Charity Commission to put this structure in place. And it's, as Mark has I think alluded to a number of times, it's the Charity Commission that can be a real problem in these negotiations in slowing things down. But having said how wonderful this structure is, I do have to just sound a quick health warning to say it's not quick and easy and cost-free to set up. It will be too cumbersome for some charities, so it's not the panacea, but it will be very successful in some cases. I would say this, wouldn't I? But at times like these, being part of a third sector strategy group could be invaluable. This is where you might find your friends who you can start talking to perhaps enter into some kind of cost sharing agreement. And I should add that Mark and I have been working together for many years in the charity sector. So we have the experience and expertise to help guide you through this process if it's something you want to consider.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Brian. Thank you very much, Mark. I mean, Mark and Brian are regular contributors to TSSG, and for being technical experts, they have a fantastic ability to communicate the message in an understandable way. So thank you very much for your input there. Just quickly, just looking at sort of comments that have come through before we open up to questions and answers. Paul O'Donnell from Age UK, obviously, I don't know whether this is from personal experience or whether he's got the scars on his back or not. Talking about sort of mergers and takeovers, pensions and Section 75 debt can be a showstopper. Also, 2p of staff and taking on local government pension scheme commitments.
I think we probably blinded people with science there.
or it could be. I'm conscious of the fact that discussions of this nature might be something that you want to take offline. But I think what we will see. Obviously, we've had a look at the sort of practical aspects, but I think this will be coming very much to the fore. Because I think COVID-19 has acted as a bit of a driver to a certain extent to make sure that existing charities are focused, but also are driving their efficiency. But I think this will be a way forward for a lot of charities, particularly if it's just some form of collaboration agreement, as Mark said, as a sort of toe in the water before seeing whether there's anything else as to whether there are advantages in working more closely together. Thank you again, Mark, and thank you, Brian. Thank you for attending the TSSG Deep Dive. I think we've probably shown some of the factors that as charitable organisations we need to show in today's climate. I think we've shown a little bit of adaptability in terms of, thank you, Dan, for going in, coming out and coming back in again. So we've adapted to that. A certain amount of resilience to make sure that we can keep going. But ultimately, TSSG is a community to allow you to understand where your charity needs to go next. So what I'd like to do is just open up this final session. There may be final Q&As, or what I'd like to do is make sure that you're taking action moving forward. It's fine joining us for a couple of hours, but what we want to try and do is, before you go back to the operational day-to-day of your charity, if there's anything that struck a chord, something that you need to do differently, now is the time to do it. So if you want to come through and give me some take-home points, just put them in the chat box or anything like that. That'd be great. So I'll wait for those to come through. As I said at the beginning, we've got a recording that is still ongoing, but we'll edit it and we'll have that available on our YouTube channel. Sophie will be getting in touch with you to put through a link to that. Also, we'll be sending through copies of the slides, and I think there are some useful hyperlinks through there. I'm thinking particularly on Dan's side to that guidance being issued from the Institute of Fundraising with regard to how we may adapt to our fundraising moving forward, so that we can get that connection back between people wanting to give, but the way that we were raising money may have not met up with it. So I think that's well worth having a look at. Also, I think Sophie has been putting through some links on the chat side in terms of some of the presentations and articles that I talked about on the change side. And finally, we've got the links there through in terms of if you're looking at some form of collaboration or mergers or collaborative working, as to the sort of kind of checklist that you may wish to use with your trustees. In terms of next steps, we're staying around probably for the next 10 minutes, quarter an hour or so. So if you do want to stay on and you want to ask some questions, please do so. In terms of a call to action, one of the things that we're looking at, there's an offer open to each charity that's come online today. We're offering an agility review. So if there's something that has struck a chord with you today, one of the things that we can do is have an agility review with you, and we'll be looking at the circumstances with your charity, digging a little bit deeper than we have done so far, doing some diagnostics and coming up with an agile plan as the 2 or 3 things that you need to do and how you're going to put a framework in place to achieve them. So just some comments coming through. Let's have a quick look. So some thank yous. Thank you very much indeed. Claire Watley is saying, I can reiterate the matter of time-consuming and long-lasting. We've been in discussions with another small charity for over 12 months. So there we go. That's someone else feeling the pain. And then we've got Kelly. Thank you for really insightful presentations. Lots of thoughts and ideas to take away. Much appreciated. Jill, thank you very much. Well presented conference. And Claire coming back. Thank you to Dan. Specific thank you to Dan in terms of the fundraising and the sort of adaptation in terms of how you do that on a virtual basis. So for those of you that need to get away and get back to the day job, we finished 10 minutes early. So before you go back, make sure that you use those 10 minutes wisely before the day-to-day comes back in. Make 2 or 3 bullet points as to what you're going to do differently after this. Thank you very much for taking part on our first deep dive. We're going to be running them on a regular basis, at least every 6 months. But in the meantime, we're going to be having our usual half-an-hour catch-up, and we'll be sending out the regular invitations to that. So if you've enjoyed it today and you'd like to become part of the the wider tribe or community that is the third sector strategy group, you're very most welcome to come along. So if you need to go now, it's been lovely to have you online. If you want to stay behind, if you want to ask some questions, we'll do that while other people have left, and you can ask the questions to the people on that are remaining. So thanks very much indeed. Stay on if you want to. We'll be around for a little bit, but if you're leaving now, thank you very much indeed. Yeah, Jill, yeah, we can hear you, Jill.
Really good, thank you all. It'd be really interesting to know how many participants we had outside of the within the TSSG, and also did we have many outside the TSSG?
We did. We had quite a lot of new people come in and join us, and I think that that's the beauty of the sort of virtual platform. It's lovely to meet face to face, but the beauty, I think, one of the things that we found with hosting this virtually is that that we can touch a lot more people that have charitable needs. So yes, okay. We have. I've got a comment from Cheryl saying I'm missing the cake meeting face to face. There we go. There are always downsides, aren't there?
Yeah, it's Paul here, Richard. Yeah.
Hello, Paul. How are you? You all right?
Yeah, fine, thanks. It's just the group structure. Obviously, the companies are probably the charities are probably companies limited by guarantee or CIOs or whatever. So the actual control issue would be sharing common trustees, would it? Yeah.
No, it's actually not.
No.
It's you have to create a member structure. So you have to have the parent charity become a member of the subsidiary charities, and that through that membership you're creating a pseudo shareholding, if you like, separating the ownership from the day-to-day control, which would still be with the trustees.
Okay, so it's not just common trustees having common control, and no,
okay. that wouldn't work, and probably wouldn't actually meet the objectives of the trustees or the charities involved. So yeah, that's where the extra bit of legal work is required to make this work.
Okay.
Fantastic. Is there anything else you wanted to come back on there, Paul?
No, not really. I was just a matter of interest, really. Yeah.
And you made a very good point, Paul, about the pension side of things, hijacking potential restructurings.
Yeah, I mean, potentially you can reach withdrawal agreements, but then you still have a load of debt hanging around to crystallise in the future, you know, but too complicated. And as for LGPS, they're ridiculous, you know. So that's my opinion anyway.
Well, that's the whole idea of TSSG is you know, experiences that people had in terms of you know, things that work and things that don't work.
Well, I mean, just to say, we had somebody who left early because we made them redundant, and even though they were overpaid on their LGPS pension fund, we still had to make another payment to cover the fact that they'd left early.
Well, thanks for the contribution, Paul, and we'll look forward to seeing you I say virtually face to face at the next TSSG when we get together. Thanks to everybody for their contributions. It's been brilliant.